Good morning, everyone. I hope you have had a wonderful week. This morning we come to Matthew chapter 5 once again. And today we're going to consider from verse 38. And if you would turn there, you would see that it starts with the phrase, an eye for an eye. Do you know who said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind? That was Mahatma Gandhi, supposedly. Everywhere I've read about this, people say he is referring to and contradicting Exodus, which is one of the passages in the Bible where it says, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and so on. It is said that Gandhi meant that retribution is not a solution and only perpetuates an endless cycle of violence. He suggests that if we continue to punish those we deem cruel, then we are no better than them. You cannot solve violence with violence, he said. But where does that leave us with Exodus 21:24? Was the Bible wrong? Should we disregard that? Is that an Old Testament thing and we have moved on since then? I found an article online that says this. We're guessing the authors of Exodus weren't being super literal when they talked about an eye for an eye. Someone losing an eye in exchange for someone else losing an eye probably isn't in anyone's best interest. It basically means that when something awful is done by someone, they deserve to have the same thing done to them. Like if some goober drops and breaks your MacBook, then it's only fair for you to take his MacBook and break it. That's from a publication called Shmoop. So let's not take it too seriously. But it does have a ring of truth, doesn't it? It doesn't seem to make sense. An eye for an eye doesn't seem to benefit anyone. And let's consider the other side. What is right and what is fair? If you get in an accident and it's not your fault, surely there must be some compensation. Let's say you're assaulted and the other guy knocks out your tooth and you confront him. What is right and fair? I'm sure you wouldn't say, well, let's knock out his tooth, but are you going to do nothing? Let's read the passage for today and hear what Jesus says. You have heard that it is said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go a mile, go with him too. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Excuse me. So what does Jesus say here? If someone knocks your tooth out, should you turn the other cheek and say, I've got plenty more teeth? Is Jesus and Gandhi both here contradicting the Old Testament? Obviously this needs some explanation, and that is what we're going to do today. We're going to look at this passage and others and find out what exactly it is that Jesus meant, what the truth is, and whether or not he is actually nullifying the Old Testament. Now, to set this up a bit more, I want to read a few articles covering some events that happened in this past week. It will add some significance, I hope, to our study this morning. The first is from an article in the Washington Post entitled, U.S. strikes on the Houthis were strong, proportionate, and overdue. It says this. The U.S.-led airstrikes against targets in the Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen represent a new level of American involvement in the Middle East upheaval that began on October 7. Some regional analysts are already warning that the action plays into the Houthis' hands and risks igniting a wider Middle East conflagration without much chance of having their intended effect to deter further Houthi attacks on international shipping. Precisely the opposite is true. The Houthis already escalated the regional conflict by using the pretext of Israel's war with Hamas to launch unprovoked attacks against commercial ships traveling the Red Sea. The United States and its coalition allies, Britain, Canada, Australia, and the Netherlands and Bahrain, had little choice but to mount a strong response. And this coalition employed just the right amount of proportionate firepower. If the Biden administration could be faulted for anything, it is that the same effort taken sooner might have had a greater effect. Consider this in light of our passage today. An eye for an eye. Is this right or wrong? The title of the article suggests that it was not just right, but overdue. I'll read it again. U.S. airstrikes on the Houthis were strong, proportional, and overdue. That's an interesting and not coincidental title. We've been hearing a lot about proportional response in the past 4 months since the war in Israel started. And it seems right, doesn't it? But isn't this exactly the problem that Gandhi and Jesus is talking about? After all, this is what the Cold War was. Mutually assured destruction. An eye for an eye until the whole world has been reduced to rubble. This is a sentiment captured poignantly in one of my daughter's favorite songs, 99 Red Balloons, which ends with the words, "It's all over and I'm standing pretty in this dust that was a city. If I could find a souvenir just to prove the world was here, and here it is, a red balloon, I think of you and let it go." Rebecca, of course, has no idea what the song is really about. All she hears is balloons. But is this what Jesus is talking about? That an eye for an eye is just an endless cycle of violence that will continue until everything is destroyed. But let me read another article, this time from the New York Times. I think it was on Monday. Federal prosecutors will seek the death penalty against the gunman who killed 10 black people in a racist massacre at a Buffalo supermarket in May 2022. That's Buffalo, New York. According to court papers filed on Friday, it is the first time that President Biden's administration has sought the death penalty in a new case. The gunman, Peyton Gendron, who is white, who committed the attack after posting a hateful white supremacist manifesto online, had already been sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole on state charges last year. He had pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder and a single count of domestic terrorism motivated by hate. New York ended capital punishment, but the federal government has charged Mr. Gendron, 20, with hate crimes and gun charges that could bring the death penalty. Prosecutors said in the Friday filing in the Western District of New York that the circumstances of the charges were such that in the event of a conviction, a sentence of death is justified. Mr. Gendron, in choosing the location of the shooting, did so in order to maximize the number of black victims of the offense, prosecutors wrote. And then listen to this. Former President Donald J. Trump resumed carrying out the federal death penalty after nearly a two-decade hiatus, even as the overall number of executions in the United States fell. Mr. Biden campaigned on the ending the federal death penalty, promising to pause federal executions and urging states to follow suit. That year, the Justice Department, under Attorney General Merrick Garland, imposed a moratorium on federal executions. However, even with a pause on executions themselves, the Justice Department has taken a mixed approach to pursuing capital sentences. For example, the jury deliberating in the case of Robert Bowers, who murdered 11 worshippers in their Pittsburgh synagogue in 2018, unanimously agreed last year on the sentence of death. Mr. Garland did not withdraw the request for death penalty in that case. Regarding the Buffalo supermarket massacre, in a statement on Friday, lawyers for several of the victims' families said the decision to seek the death penalty provided a pathway to both relief and measure of closure for the victims and their families. So what do we do about this? Here's a case of an evil man who killed 10 people. If there is ever a case for the death penalty, this is it. When you hear about a crime with such unambiguous, undiluted evil, everything within us cries out for justice. Every breath this evil man takes is an offense to everything that is right and true and good. So what do we think about this? Exodus says an eye for an eye, a life for a life. Sure, he has been sentenced to life in prison, but is that right? Is that justice? And extend that to our own context. How do we consider our own disputes? The neighbor ran over my daughter's bicycle. Do I just let it go and say, I understand it was an accident, go in peace? What if it wasn't an accident? What if he did it on purpose? Do I go in reverse over his daughter's bicycle? What if my daughter was on the bicycle and now she has a broken leg? Do I go and break his daughter's leg? Surely not. But do I do nothing? Do I tell my daughter, let him break your other leg also? Surely not. So let us this morning study this passage. Let us find out what it means. Let us be humble and accept that this is our God speaking with authority. And the things that the Bible says must regulate the way that we live. But let us be wise and not just hear what we want to hear, but let us consider what it really means. So let's look again at the passage in Matthew 5, verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Again, it seems to us that Jesus here is contradicting the Old Testament. This would go in line with what the Pharisees were thinking already. Recall, we studied this over the past 2 weeks. They firmly believed Jesus had come to abolish the Old Testament, disregard all the rules and regulations, and do his own thing. This is why, earlier in this passage, Jesus cleared the air, so to speak. And he said, do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all has been accomplished. And I will remind us all that this is in fact true. Jesus did not come to abolish the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the Word of God, just like the New Testament. All of it is true, all of it is inerrant, all of it is relevant to us, and all of it must be obeyed. So what is Jesus saying here? Well, let us first consider these passages in the Old Testament. He's referencing the Old Testament. Not a jot or tittle will ever pass away. So let's look at these passages. The first is, there are actually 3 passages that reference, yet there is no injury. He shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Then there's Leviticus 24 verse 19. It says this, if a man injures his neighbor, just as he has done, so it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Just as he has injured a man, so it shall be inflicted on him. Then Deuteronomy 19 verse 15. A single witness shall not rise up against a man on the account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed. And then it goes into detail about malicious witnesses and judges and how to judge. And then it ends with this. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. The rest will hear and be afraid, and never again do such an evil thing among you. Thus you shall not show pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. All 3 of these passages deal with the same kind of matter. And let us be careful to understand what it is really about. What we find in these 3 passages in the Old Testament is a principle that is actually still in our laws today. I'm going to talk about some legal stuff. I am not versed in legal things, but you can speak to the lawyers among us and confirm whether or not what I'm saying is true. Now, the principle is called lex talionis, the law of retaliation. The common term, however, is the punishment should fit the crime. This is the principle we find in these 3 passages in the Old Testament. The punishment should fit the crime. The first passage says, if a man strikes a woman and she gives birth prematurely and the baby lives, there's no further injury, the punishment should be a fine for the injury. However, if the baby dies or if there's further injury, the punishment should be proportional to the injury, life for life. The second passage, likewise, if you injure someone, and in the context it's not an accident, it is on purpose. The punishment should be proportional to the injury. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. And if the one who kills a man shall be put to death. The third passage in Deuteronomy is even more technical, dealing with false witnesses and judges and courts, but ends with the same. You shall not show pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Now this is crucial. The context of all three of these passages is the law. These are laws. They would have been gazetted in our vernacular. The principle, as we have said, is that of proportional punishment. The punishment should be proportional to the crime that was committed. There was a crime. The third passage we looked at goes so far as to say that you must not show pity. Why? It would be wrong to show pity. It goes so far to say it would be wrong to show pity. Why is this important? Because the court is not a place for pity, it is a place for justice. A crime has been committed. There has been an assault, perhaps causing grievous bodily injury, or worse, murder. This is not the place to show pity. It would be wrong to show pity to a murderer. In this case, justice must prevail, for our God is a God of justice. He will by no means let the guilty go unpunished, and neither can any just court on earth let guilty go unpunished. Deuteronomy 16 verse 19 says, You shall not distort justice. You shall not be partial. You shall not take a bribe, for the bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Now these passages we looked at, they are there to protect the weak and to restrain the strong. They are there to restrain the evil in the heart of man. They are there to say that all of society must come together and make sure that if anyone does evil, there be consequences for that evil, and that evil will be driven out. Let's draw a few conclusions about these passages. How do these passages apply to us? Firstly, note once again that this is a legal context. We all have vengeance in our hearts. This is a temptation for us. What God is saying here in these passages in the Old Testament is that retribution is for courts. If somebody does you wrong, don't take vengeance on him. There are laws and regulations. Leviticus 19 verse 18 says, You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbors as yourself. I am the Lord. And the Lord has given plentiful instruction in the Bible of how to deal with these kinds of disputes. And even though we are not in Old Testament times, God has still given us governments to deal with disputes and make sure that there is order in society. Romans 13 says this, Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. God has given us governments and laws and courts and systems so that, as far as it is possible here on earth, there may be safety for the weak and restraints for those who would seek to do evil. We must be careful not to defy our governments. For example, let's say you're speeding and the police officer pulls you over and he gives you a ticket. That is right. Imagine if you made an accident and killed someone. That would be a crime. In our legal system, that would be called culpable homicide. It's a crime. Now, we know the legal system and our governments and officials are not perfect. Officials are sometimes corrupt or inconsistent in how they apply the law. But that doesn't mean we get to ignore laws which are good and right, and in this example, not contradictory to Scripture, but actually an upholding of what Scripture says is good and right. Likewise, if we get in an accident and let's say the other person is clearly at fault, we are not to get out a tire and iron and go and exact vengeance upon this hooligan. There are laws and regulations and institutions that are given to us to deal with these situations. For example, we have insurance that will pay mostly for our misfortunes in such a situation. There are police and prosecutors and courts that deal with criminals. And again, these are imperfect and flawed as they would be expected to be here on earth. But that doesn't mean we get to ignore the mandate from Scripture to obey the rule of law. Finally, the most important takeaway from these passages is that we are not to take personal vengeance on someone when they wrong us. If there is a crime committed, even criminals have a right to due process. This is to ensure that justice will be carried out. These passages imply that it would be a miscarriage of justice to repay someone eye for eye, tooth for tooth, without involving the authorities, where there would be witnesses and judges and equitable sentences for crimes committed. We are not to hold grudges. We are not to take revenge. Now, what you should ask yourself is this: why does Jesus seemingly contradict these passages? Or, rather, since we have said Jesus is not contradicting these passages, what does he mean? Now, what the Pharisees and teachers of the law had done is taken these principles and applied them to everyday life, almost in a way making them mean exact opposite of what they really meant. They, like us, had a heart of vengeance and retribution, ruled by our emotions sometimes. The Bible condemns these things, and a part of the sanctification process for us believers, as we are being made more like Jesus, is to not be vengeful or hold grudges. But the religious teachers of the day, they had their own interpretation of the Bible, and they had watered down the Scriptures. They believed that if anything wrong happened to you, no matter how small, you had the right, no, the responsibility to take action immediately, make things right. Their hearts were filled with hate, and they reveled in any opportunity to express it. We can only imagine how they applied this eye for an eye. Imagine if all of your life is an eye for an eye. In any context. If someone accidentally hurt him, you would punch him right back in the face right away. Say, oh, it's an eye for an eye. Somebody broke your window, you took a rock and you broke his window right back. Or perhaps demand immediate compensation. I'm going to take you to court. You broke my window. Let's go. And if you resisted, they dragged you off. Eye for an eye. Do we sometimes act like this? Road rage? Someone cuts you off so you tailgate him? I saw a video this past week, where someone was boasting that somebody had said something mean to him on the internet, so he found out where he worked and got him fired. We're sometimes like that. You waited too long at KFC, so you leave a 1-star review. The kitchen got your order wrong, so you don't tip the waitress. You stand in line all day at Home Affairs, and you get to the front, and you take it out on the person behind the counter. You know how long I've been here? Make sure everybody knows how annoyed you are. How about closer to home? The preacher says something you don't like, so you send him an email the next day. I don't think what you said was right. So-and-so didn't greet you the other day, and now you're not going to greet them. Their children gave our children the flu last week, so we won't be inviting them again anytime soon. We have vengeful and hateful hearts sometimes. Whatever someone does to us, whether with malice or an accident, whether real or perceived, we want to retaliate. We want to express our dissatisfaction in what happened. We want them to feel the way I feel. Give them a taste of their own medicine. If we're honest, this is what's often in our hearts. We have evil hearts and vengeful spirits. Consider your families. You and your husband, you got in an argument. You've been thinking all day about how I'm going to punish him. I won't talk to him tonight. I'm going straight to bed. Or husband to wife, I'll make a side comment about the way she looks. Wonder if we should resume that gym subscription. I'm going to tell him, you're just like your mother. We hold grudges. We want revenge. We want to make sure they know how we feel. We want them to feel like I feel. Show them how it feels. I'll make him feel small. I'll make her show what it's like to be rejected. We bite and devour. We want revenge. We want our own way. Hebrews 12 verse 15 says, "See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled." Galatians 5 verse 14 says, "For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, 'You shall love your neighbor as yourself.' But if you bite and devour one another, take care that you're not consumed by one another." Now this is what was in the heart of the Jewish teachers in Jesus' day, and this is what's in our hearts. They needed to get back at you. They believed they had a right to get back. An eye for an eye. They had hateful, vengeful, retaliatory hearts. And we must guard our hearts against the same temptation. So understand that this is the context where Jesus is coming to. Now let's look at Jesus' perspective. It makes sense too. The Pharisees and the other teachers of the law, they had been watering down the scriptures all over the place. They had reworked the Bible from God's perfect standard into something that gave them an outlet for their own hate. They took the Bible, which is an impossibly high ideal, and lowered it to something they could achieve. Recall all the other things we have looked at already. The Pharisees thought they were fine as long as they didn't commit murder. But in verse 21, Jesus told them that even being angry with someone is bad enough to get you in hell. They thought they were fine as long as they didn't commit adultery. But in verse 27, Jesus tells them that even looking at someone with lust is adultery in your heart. They thought they were fine to divorce their wives left and right as long as they did the paperwork. But Jesus tells them in verse 31 that they were actually committing adultery, and the divorce is unacceptable in all circumstances except in the case of adultery. Last week we saw that they were lying left and right, bringing all sorts of technicalities about what you were swearing on or over or under. And in verse 28 Jesus tells them that they're simply lying. And finally here we are today, and we see once again that the Pharisees and the scribes and the religious teachers, they had replaced the Bible standard with their own standard. Passages in the Bible that are specifically there to prevent people from taking vengeance and retribution, the people of Jesus' day were using to enact their own ideas of vengeance and retribution. So let's remind ourselves of what Jesus says in Matthew 5 verse 38. "You have heard that it was said, 'An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth.' But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to anyone who asks of you, and do not turn away the one who wants to borrow from you." Once again, we see the pattern we saw before. Jesus takes something that somebody else says, he's in this case an eye for an eye, and then he says something along the lines of, "You have heard," and then he says, "But I say to you." We're reminded once again that Jesus is God, and he speaks authoritatively about the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, in the end of Matthew chapter 7, the people say this: "When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, not as their scribes." And as I said before, we once again have a bit of trouble, because the saying that the people had in the day is a direct quotation of the Old Testament. This is certainly what the scribes and Pharisees thought. Jesus is contradicting the Old Testament. He is contradicting us. That's what they thought. But this is not the case. We saw that the passage Jesus was using was intended in the context of courts and laws. And the people of Jesus' day were merely using these verses to justify taking revenge on people. So we see once again that Jesus is not lowering the standard, but he's in fact raising the bar so high that no one can attain it. It is as if Jesus is saying, You have treated each other, taking eyes for eyes and feet for feet. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Turn the other cheek. Give your coat along with your shirt. Go the extra mile. Don't turn away the one who is in need. Jesus is saying, do not treat one another like you're in courts all the time. Do not treat one another eye for an eye in every context. Eye for an eye is required in the courtroom where justice must prevail, where judgment must be equitable, where punishment must fit crime. But do not treat one another like that. You do not want your interpersonal relationships to be like courts, just like we don't want the courts to be like interpersonal relationships. Now, to drive this point home, Jesus uses 4 illustrations. There is turning the other cheek. There is giving your coat as well as your shirt. There is going the extra mile. And there's not turning away the borrower. He sets these up in verse 38 and 39, and he says this. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. What does he mean? Do not resist evil. Now first understand that Jesus is not teaching us to be passive. Some have interpreted it as such and would say that Jesus is saying we just ignore it when evil things happen. Just ignore the evil around us. We're in an evil world. Just, grit and bear it. Now, this is obviously not true because there are many passages that does tell us to resist evil. For example, James 4 verse 7 says, resist the devil and he will flee for you. Again, 1 Peter 5, verse 8, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him. We are to resist the devil. We are to resist evil. This is both referring to the sin which the devil may tempt us to commit, and in the world, where he inspires all sorts of evil. Look at 1 Corinthians 5 verse 11. I wrote to you, do not associate with any so-called brother if he is an immoral person, covetous, idolater. Paul is saying, don't associate with someone who claims to be a Christian yet leads an evil life. Resist him. Paul himself was an example of such a kind of thing when he confronted Peter because of the evil he was doing. In Galatians 2 verse 11, Paul says, but when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. Paul here resists Peter. And then he says, for prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But then when these men came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. Paul resisted Peter. He opposed Peter with the hopes of turning him back. We likewise see in Matthew 18 verse 15, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. We are called to confront our brothers and sisters, our fellow believers, when they go astray, when they fall into sin. We want to bring them back. And notice Matthew 18 verse 16. But if he does not listen to you, take 1 or 2 more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. You remember where we heard this? This was Deuteronomy 19. This speaks again to the context. The context is not interpersonal relationships, but matters of truth and righteousness. Even though Matthew 18 and Paul in Galatians 2 refer to situations where someone is being ushered back into the faith, not necessarily a court situation, nonetheless, these situations are situations where a proper distinction between good and evil is called for. So, when Jesus says, don't resist evil, he is not referring to situations such as these. Rather, when Jesus says, don't resist an evil person, he means, do not set yourself against an evil person. Do not hold a grudge against someone because he has committed evil against you. Do not take revenge on someone who has acted in evil against you. Do not repay evil for evil. Proverbs 20 verse 22 says, do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, he will save you. This is where Jesus is coming from. Do not seek your own revenge, for vengeance is the Lord's. Do not repay evil for evil, but rather trust in God. Jesus continues, but I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. Now this is perhaps one of the most famous sayings of Jesus. Turn the other cheek. It's become an idiom. This once again has been taken to mean that we are to be passive, but this is not exactly right. Jesus here says, when someone slaps you, turn the other cheek also. Now, Jesus is not referring to a fight. He is not referring to being punched in the face. This is a slap, like a... To slap someone is to demean. To fight someone is to consider an equal. It's fighting back. But to slap someone is humiliating. It's like the back of the hand. It's like it's a dog. What Jesus is saying here is, turn your other cheek and be slapped again rather than retaliate. This is the point Jesus is making. When you are demeaned, when you are humiliated, don't retaliate. Rather get demeaned more rather than retaliate. Once again, Jesus did not just portray these things, he practiced them. Matthew 27 verse 27 says, Then the soldiers and the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe around him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. And we read in 1 Peter 2:23, Jesus, while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. Such humiliation, yet no retaliation and no retribution. This is what Jesus is saying. Don't retaliate, rather be reviled. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? Which brings us to the next illustration. Jesus says in verse 40, if someone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Though the courts have a place in justice and righteousness, there are certain evil people who may use the courts for evil with frivolous lawsuits. People who sue or threaten to sue so that they can take revenge or take advantage. Lawsuits can be expensive, and even the threat of a lawsuit can be a source of great distress. Lawsuits can also be very messy, driving a wedge between friendships and family members. This is especially true if we are in situations where the courts are being made to deal with matters which courts should not be dealing with. Frivolous cases that can more easily be settled around the dinner table than in the courts. What Jesus is saying here, if someone is up in arms because of some perceived wrong and he wants to sue you, rather give him what he wants and be at peace than drag something into court that doesn't need to be there and experience real animosity. The same kind of thing Paul urges believers to do. He urges believers to avoid lawsuits with one another. 1 Corinthians 6 says, does any of you, when he has a case against his neighbor, dare to go to the law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? If the world is judged by you, are you not competent to constitute the smallest law courts? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more matters of this life? So if you have law courts dealing with matters of this life, do you appoint them as judges who are of no account in the church? I say this to your shame. Is it so that there is not one among you? Is it so that there is not among you one wise man who will be able to decide between his brethren? But if brother goes to law with brother, and that before unbelievers, actually then it is already defeat for you that you have lawsuits with one another. And then he says, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? He's saying it would be so much simpler if you just dealt with these conflicts that you have with one another inside the church. Do you not have people among you who is wise enough to handle these disputes? And yet you go and drag these things into courts, and now you've made real enemies. This is what Jesus is saying. Rather be defrauded, rather be wronged. If someone wants to sue you for your shirt, rather lose your coat also, and perhaps remain in good terms with a neighbor than go to the courts and gain a sure enemy. And I should point out that a coat was a very valuable possession. In those days, clothes were not mass-produced. People had perhaps only a few changes of clothes, and perhaps only a single coat. The coat or cloak was used to keep you warm in the cold or while traveling and to sleep in. Consider Exodus 22 verse 26. It says, if you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you want to return it to him before the sun sets. For that is his only covering. It is his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? And it shall come about that when he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. You can imagine what it is like. You and your neighbor have a dispute about something. Let's say the leaves from his tree are falling into your pool. So you cut down the branches. And this really upsets him. And so he comes and says, I demand compensation, or I'm going to take you to court. Now I'm pretty sure this will count as a frivolous lawsuit and wouldn't have success. But what is better? Going to court and having your neighbor as an enemy, or settling, even if it is at a great cost, and living in peace? What is a better testimony? What is Jesus saying here? Jesus is saying, rather do that than make this into a big dispute. Verse 41 has another famous saying. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. And I fear this one especially has had his meaning distorted from what Jesus meant. We take it to mean to go the extra mile, work extra hard, put in an extra effort. It means be conscientious, be a good worker, and so on. And I'm sure you can also tell that this doesn't quite fit into the eye for an eye context. To understand what this means, we must explore the context of the day. At this point in history, Jerusalem was a vassal of Rome. That is to say, the king, for example, King Herod, was appointed by Rome, and he was appointed to rule in a way that advanced Roman interests. They had to do things such as collect taxes for Rome. You remember those tax collectors? And they were prohibited from doing things such as executing people, which is why, for example, when they wanted to execute Jesus, they had to go through Pontius Pilate, because they weren't allowed to do it. They also had to do what Roman authorities told them to do to some extent. It would happen that some menial tasks had to be done, and the Roman authorities would conscript the locals to do certain things, to do their dirty work, so to speak. A good example of this is Luke 23, where the Roman authorities they forced a man called Simon to carry Jesus' cross. This is what Luke 23 verse 26 says. When they led Jesus away, they seized the man, Simon of Cyrene, coming from the country, and they placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus. They forced this man, Simon, to carry Jesus' cross. But even in these situations, there were restrictions. Even in these circumstances, there were laws and regulations. The people were not enslaved after all. And so the Romans could ask you to carry something, but they could not ask you to carry it for further than 1 mile. This is what Jesus is referring to. You will note that the verse says, whoever forces you to go 1 mile. He is referring to being conscripted by the Roman authorities to carry something 1 mile. Now, I think it's fair to say that this ties into next week's message, because Jesus is here telling people to show compassion to the Roman authorities. Next week we're going to hear about love your enemy. You see, the Jews hated the Romans. As far as they were concerned, the Romans were an illegitimate government, just like the Babylonians and the Assyrians before them. They were being unjustly oppressed by Gentiles who restricted them from self-government. And you can imagine how one might respond if one of these Gentile Romans came to you and forced you to carry a package to the next town. It's like you're busy watering your garden, and a guy stops next to you and he says, take this package, go to Bronkhorstspruit and deliver this package for me. And you're like, I'm busy. But you had to do it. It'd make you pretty upset. It would make you angry. It would make you humiliated that somebody comes and forces you to do something. So then comes Jesus and says, you know what? In that situation, don't have a vindictive spirit. Don't hold a grudge. He asks you to go 1 mile, go 2. Think of how this may apply in your situation. Jesus used these colorful illustrations to make us understand that since we are not likely in these extreme situations, how much more should we behave towards others in love and grace and kindness and compassion? Perhaps you have a difficult employer. Go the extra mile for him, in the vernacular meaning of the word. Perhaps you have a contentious in-law that treats you like dirt. I'm sure they treat you better than the Romans treated the Jews. Love them. We come to the final illustration. Jesus says, "Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn from him who wants to borrow from you." Here Jesus goes above and beyond the previous illustrations. We started with an eye for an eye, and Jesus says, don't resist an evil person. But now we've gone all the way to the other end of the spectrum, where we're being called to be generous and magnanimous. The Pharisees and other Jewish leaders were notoriously stingy, something Jesus addressed on other occasions as well. Jesus here gives two instructions: be ready to give and be ready to lend. This is something we see in many places in the Bible, the Old Testament as well. For example, Deuteronomy 15 verse 7. If there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land which the Lord God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother. Proverbs 21 verse 13 says, he who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and not be answered. Psalm 112 verse 5. It is well with the man who is gracious and lends. He will maintain his cause in judgment. And likewise the apostles call attention to this. I'm Afrikaans. 1 John 3 verse 17. But whoever has the world's good and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? And this is what Jesus is coming to. In this and in all these illustrations, what is in your heart? Does the love of God abide in you? Do you realize that each thing that Jesus highlights here describes his character? We know Jesus did not resist the evil man, that he turned the other cheek. They cast lots for his clothing. That when these despicable Romans were crucifying him, he prayed, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. And that he gave his life for our sins. This is what it comes down to. Jesus is addressing the heart of the Pharisee. And this heart is in us all, so we should pay special attention. We are not naturally full of love and grace. The love of God does not abide in us naturally. From the beginning, the principle has been love the people around us. To not be vindictive, seeking revenge, holding grudges. The Pharisees and the other Jewish people had made this hatefulness and vileness into their own man-made religion. The law had established that the law had established these principles for courts and criminal proceedings. The punishment should fit the crime: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. The Pharisees and the other Jewish people had taken this principle, a principle given to protect the weak and restrain evil, and they had twisted it into something they used to oppress and get their own way. Every little thing they found offensive, they made as a matter of life and death. They were dragging people to court, or at least threatening to, for every little thing. They were taking offense at everything and coming down on everyone who wronged them, whether insignificant or not. This is not how it is in the kingdom of heaven. This is not how it should be with us. Jesus showed us the way. We are to be humble, willing to be wronged, willing to be defrauded for the sake of the kingdom. This is core to the gospel message. Romans 5 verse 8 says this: God demonstrated his own love towards us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We deserved eye for an eye. We have sinned against God. We deserve to be punished. But Christ died for us. He took our punishment. Romans continues, much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through him. For if while we were enemies, we were God's enemies, We were reconciled to God through the death of His Son. Much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by His life.